Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 343, interview with Ambassador David McKean about his book, Watching Darkness Fall, FDR, His Ambassadors, and the Rise of Adolf Hitler. Former ambassador to Luxembourg, and before that, the Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State, Ambassador McKean is currently the Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Washington, D.C., and the author of several books, one being Tommy the Cork, Washington's Ultimate Insider from Roosevelt to Reagan. Today, he joins us to talk about how all but one of FDR's ambassadors in Europe misjudged Hitler and his intentions. Ambassador McKean, thank you very much for being with us today.
Delighted. Thank you for having me, Ray.
Absolutely. So I'm so happy to have you on this show because obviously when people hear the subject of World War II, they think about battles and weapons and tactics and all that kind of stuff. But I think what gets lost in the overall story is the storm before the storm, the 1930s, which is mostly what your book is about. And what I find interesting about this is you and I know it's coming. It's all hindsight. It's all history. And so I think people make certain observations or they just assume things. This was how it was supposed to work out. And so it did. But that's not exactly how history works. So what I enjoyed about your book is here's FDR with his ambassadors, and they have to live this out day by day. They don't know what's coming. They're doing the best they can with the information that they have. And speaking of that information, all FDR knows is what his ambassadors and other eyes and ears on the ground are telling him. But I've got to think that when he goes into the White House after winning in 1933, he's probably assuming that it's pretty much going to be domestic policies, foreign policy won't matter at all. And that's probably his and everyone else's assumption as he goes into the White House.
No, absolutely. I mean, we have to remember that this is a very, very different time in our history. You know, the means of communication at the time, and with the way Roosevelt campaigned, he campaigned on the back of a train, crisscrossing the country. And radio was really the most effective means of communication. Television was in its infancy. This was pre-internet, and so he is. Very definitely campaigning at a time. Also, you have to remember that this is the height of the Depression in the United States. Mm-hmm. You've got a massive unemployment. 25% of the people don't have a job. GDP has sunk to its all-time low in the century. And the banks are closing every day. So it's a very, very different time. And I think with the point that you make, which I think is really, really important, is that while we know the outcome, this is really the story of the 1930s and how we reached the Second World War. And there have been a lot of books about how Roosevelt conducted the war, but the time leading up to World War II is really the focus of this book. And as you said, his ambassadors at the time were his eyes and ears.
I completely agree with everything you said, and I think you've anticipated my next question. Was it those very issues, and like you said, the lead up to the war, how America got in the war, and I'm guessing, is that why you decided to write this book?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. You know, I was the ambassador to Luxembourg in 2016 and early 2017. And so they're really sort of a confluence, I guess, of things that led me to write it. One was I'd written a book in 2000 and published, I guess, in 2004 on Tommy Corcoran, who was one of Roosevelt's leading domestic advisors. And I'm a huge fan of Roosevelt. I'll say that up front. I think he was one of our greatest presidents, and I've always been very interested in him. Sure. And as an ambassador, to Luxembourg was actually invaded twice by the Nazis. It has the second, most people don't know this, the second largest U.S. military cemetery in Europe. Wow. And I did a number of events there on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, obviously, and at other times as well. And it's a very moving experience when you're walking among those gravestones of fallen heroes. Mm-hmm. And, I remember sort of thinking to myself, how did we sort of reach that point? I mean, obviously, we were in many ways with Pearl Harbor forced into war. But the events leading up to 1941 and our entrance into war was something that I hadn't fully understood. And I think sort of the combination of being an ambassador, admiring Roosevelt, and wanting to know more about how we actually got into this war in 1941 really motivated me to write the book.
Okay. Well, since you brought up Luxembourg, I have to ask, is it as lovely as it sounds? Because I've seen pictures, it's on my bucket list, but haven't quite made it there yet.
Luxembourg is a really special country. It's obviously very, very small. It's sort of got a fairy tale quality to it. But it's a fascinating place. You know, it's an original member of NATO, an original member of the European Union. And so while it's a country of only 500,000 people, they actually, as they say, they punch above their weight, and they have a huge interest in the future of Europe. So it was not only a very enjoyable time, it was just a fascinating experience.
And being literally in the middle of the country between several other major powers. I would imagine that their politics and their international politics are quite complicated. But again, one day I hope to get there because from what I've seen on the internet, it looks absolutely beautiful. So let's jump into this. So it's 1933. And FDR, again, is probably thinking with 99% of his brain about domestic policies, what he's going to be able to do to help the people as he goes into the White House. But again, what we know is that that's only going to be the first act of what is going to happen during his 4 terms, because darker clouds are coming over Europe in the form of fascism.
No, absolutely. It's interesting when Roosevelt is inaugurated. There is it's obviously actually when he wins the presidency, it's splashed across the front pages, and then when he's inaugurated, it's he's our 32nd president. But at the same time, there is a story about Adolf Hitler vying for power in Germany on the very same New York Times front page that day. And so Roosevelt was somebody who, while he was, as you said accurately, completely focused on events at home, he had a worldview. He'd been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He'd traveled to Europe as a child with his parents on numerous occasions, and so he had some sense that there were other forces out there. He knew that international trade was important and would be important to actually getting the United States out of its economic doldrums. And so that while he focused largely on domestic policy, and particularly early in those early years, he always had an eye out for what was happening abroad, and he was very, very interested in what was happening abroad. And so that's why, he felt it very important to have a personal relationship with the ambassadors that he sent to these key European capitals.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing here, but I'm assuming that in a way, the most international that he was thinking as far as finances is probably all the money that is owed to the United States from the Great War. It's like we could really use that money now, but I'm guessing that's one of the issues that he's thinking on the international front.
Absolutely, you're right about that. I mean, it's the issue of reparations was first and foremost in his mind. He was looking for funds anywhere he could find them at the time. I mean, as I said earlier, the financial institutions in the United States were closing right and left, and unemployment was at an all-time high, and the United States was in trouble. And so that if he could entice some of our European counterparts to pay some of the reparations that they owed the United States, that was very much a priority for him.
And of course, they're in the same boat that we are, struggling economically. So the meat of your book, the heart of your book, revolves around 4 ambassadors that obviously are going to be in Europe that FDR selects. And you're right, he's hoping to have a relationship with them, but he's also hoping that they're good at their job or they can give him good intelligence. Could you introduce us to these 4 main ambassadors?
Yeah, sure. They're a varied group. There's Ambassador William Dodd, who is the ambassador to Germany. And actually, Roosevelt had a very difficult time filling that position. He asked 3 or 4 other prominent American statesman to take the job of ambassador to Germany, and nobody wanted it at the time. And so he settled on William Dodd, who was he was head of the history department at the University of Chicago. He was not terribly well known, but he'd lived in Germany. Mm-hmm. He was friends with a member of Roosevelt's cabinet. Roosevelt interviewed him and liked him, and decided that he would be a fine ambassador. Mm-hmm. But he was not. He did not have a diplomatic background. And he was the ambassador there from 1933 to 1937, and we can talk a little bit more about him as we go along. The ambassador to Italy was somebody that Roosevelt did know quite well. He had an office down the hall from Roosevelt during the Wilson administration. His name was Breckinridge Long. He was very much, he's been described as Confederate aristocracy. His great-grandfather had been the Vice President John Breckinridge to President Buchanan from Kentucky. Breckinridge was from Kentucky. And Breckinridge Long had been a candidate actually twice for the U.S. Senate in Missouri and had lost, but he had been a stalwart on the Roosevelt campaign in 1932 and at the convention. And so he was awarded the very plum post of ambassador to Italy. The third ambassador who had two positions during the Roosevelt years that I talk about is William Bullitt. First, he was our first ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1933 to 1936, early 1936. And then late in 1936, he assumed the post of ambassador to France, a very, very important post as well, and obviously critical during the latter years of the 1930s. And he's an extraordinarily charismatic, interesting fellow. He negotiated with Lenin at the age of 28 on behalf of the Wilson administration. He was a flamboyant individual. He was very popular with everyone. He had a lot of charisma. He'd written a book a novel in 1926 that had actually outsold The Great Gatsby. Wow. And we can talk a little bit more about him as well, but a very, very interesting man. And then finally, the last ambassador who's quite well known, I think, to the American public is Joseph Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And Kennedy was a big supporter of Roosevelt in 1932. And Roosevelt took the unusual step of making him the chairman of the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Administration, and Kennedy was responsible in many ways for righting the ship, the financial ship, and certainly our financial structures in Washington, D.C. He oversaw the Securities and Exchange Commission, and by all accounts did an excellent job. He became ambassador in 1938, and he was not as well suited to that job as he might have been.
Right. So I find it interesting, and this still happens today. It's nothing new, but yeah, certain people can be given positions because of either help they've given or help they might give in the future. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of how governments work. But having said that, these gentlemen do come in, especially Dodd, they do come in with a different worldview, different levels of skills and experience. And so, but again, as long as they can get FDR some information that's coming from, keeping their ear to the ground, FDR should be able to keep an eye on what's going on and to the best of his ability, react accordingly.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, Dodd was the thing he was sort of most concerned about was he was not a wealthy man. The other three ambassadors I referred to earlier were all quite wealthy, and from sort of prominent families. William Dodd was a rather simple fellow. Grew up in North Carolina, very, very smart individual. As I say, head of the history department, University of Chicago, but didn't have really any idea what he was getting into. He'd lived in Germany for a year as a student, spoke German pretty well, but had no idea what was going to be involved here. And when he arrived in Germany, his sort of initial view was that to wait and see what would happen with the German government. He didn't initially have any preconceived notions about Hitler. But pretty quickly, he discovered that this was a brutal part of the German society, the Nazi Party. And he was there as the Nazis gained increasingly a stranglehold over not only over the government, but over German society.
Right.
And it distressed him greatly.
Yeah, he's going to see this literally unfold before him. He's going to tell FDR everything that he can, but obviously FDR can only do so much being the president of a different country. Correct me if I'm wrong. Did Dodd speak German?
Yeah, he spoke German. I think reasonably well. I don't think he was fluent, but he spoke German. He carried on his meetings with German officials in German, so he certainly had better than conversational German.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, because that will become important later when he's actually sitting with Hitler more than once, and he's kind of trying to read the man. Because if you can understand their native language, that really helps. Before we go on, I have to tell you that I've always been fascinated about William Bullitt. Ever since I've read about him, you're right, he was absolutely flamboyant. Would I have accepted a party invitation from him? Absolutely, because you knew it was going to be great. But the one part that I don't think I appreciated until I read your book, in fact, I was thinking about writing a book about William Bullitt, but because of you, I don't have to now. He was focused on himself. He did play the game, and he did want to advance. And at the end of the day, you've got to, if you're his boss and you love talking to him, you do have to keep that in mind, that he is probably trying to get closer to a goal that pretty much has to do with just about him.
He's a very interesting, capable person. Mm-hmm. He's somebody, again, who I think when he entered a room, people were sort of naturally attracted to him because he had such wide-ranging knowledge. And I think he had the potential to be a very, very good ambassador. And he certainly made some misjudgments along the way. In fact, he told Roosevelt in 1933, Roosevelt had sent him abroad even before he was in the White House to talk to some of the European leaders. And Bullitt came back, and he made a gross miscalculation about Hitler. He thought Hitler was really a flash in the pan, right. That this was somebody who would not last as a major political figure in Germany. And of course, he was dead wrong about that. But later on, as the ambassador to France, he gave Roosevelt really pretty good advice. He understood at a certain point that there was that war was inevitable. He advised Roosevelt to begin arming the United States, that we needed to put a lot more money into an American Air Force and into a well-equipped army, and so that he's a very complex figure, because the other thing I think that you said earlier was absolutely correct. He's a wildly ambitious guy, He wants to be in Roosevelt. He desperately wants to be in Roosevelt's cabinet. And in 1938 and 9, he is consistently writing to Roosevelt these very sort of saccharine letters, very flattering letters to Roosevelt. And he always ends them by saying, by the way, I would be a wonderful addition to your cabinet. He's an interesting man.
Right. So we've got FDR, who's now ensconced in the White House. He's going to get into his domestic policies. We've got the ambassadors who are chosen at different times for these countries, but someone has to run the State Department. And for that, FDR picks Cordell Hull. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the State Department, its larger functions, and about Hull himself.
Sure. So the State Department, at the time, first of all, it was housed in what is currently the old Executive Office building. It was one of 3 departments in that building. That tells you how Washington has grown. Right. It was a relatively small agency at the time, relatively small department. There were 2,500 support staff and about 700 professional diplomats, most of whom had gone to Ivy League colleges, right. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. They were Roosevelt often referred to them as the striped pants boys. And it was interesting. It's very interesting because Roosevelt's such a complicated figure. He, in many ways, He's he's very much from an upper class elite background, but he actually disdains a lot of the people in the State Department because he feels as though, particularly those who are serving abroad, he feels as though many of them are on paid vacations, and he's not a fan of the State Department in many ways. And Cordell Hull is an interesting man. He's a good senator. He's from Tennessee. He's a very courtly individual, very proper. He wears starched white shirts, and he looks the part of a statesman. He's an authority on international trade. Again, I think emblematic of Roosevelt's view that he wanted somebody who would help to restart the American economy. He did not have a diplomatic background, however, and he was not well traveled. And he was, I think Roosevelt liked him, but there's a story by a contemporary journalist, John Gunther, who wrote about Roosevelt at the time, and he said there must have been 1,000 times that Roosevelt had wished his undersecretary, Sumner Welles, who was a very charismatic and extremely intelligent man, was running the department and was running the meetings in the State Department meetings with Roosevelt, because he found Cordell Hull to be somewhat boring, frankly. So interesting man, good man, a solid man.
Right. But speaking of that, as we're going to see, and you've touched on this already, but as we're going to see, FDR, for the most part, accepts Hull with all his limitations. He's not flamboyant. He's not exciting. He's going to do everything the proper way and the proper time. And you need that, but that's not exactly the way FDR operates. But there is going to be different levels of closeness that FDR has with his ambassadors, and also with people who, let's just call them unofficial ambassadors. And so that closeness FDR seems to value very much. I guess maybe all leaders do. Someone that you can open up with, someone that you can talk with, and that's going to affect their relationships over these years in the 1930s.
No, that's a really good point, Ray. Again, if you go through this list of ambassadors, with William Dodd, he's never really close to William Dodd, the ambassador to Germany. He likes him, he respects him, but they don't have any sort of a friendship. It's when they have meetings in the White House, it's all business. Right. With Breckinridge Long, he's got this sort of political relationship. He respects Long's political acumen, and he rather likes him. In the end, Roosevelt's sort of top advisors, including Eleanor, his wife, really detest Long, and that has some influence over the president, to be honest. William Bullitt is an interesting man. Again, we've talked about him, but he flatters Roosevelt at every turn. He actually has a romantic affair with Roosevelt's secretary, Missy LeHand, who is extremely close to Roosevelt. Roosevelt approves of it, but really what William Bullitt's trying to do is just to get closer to the boss.
Wow.
By having an affair with his secretary. Right. And he's got so much charm, William Bullitt, but so does Roosevelt, and they get along famously for a number of years. But at a certain point, when Roosevelt doesn't think he's getting good advice, and when he thinks, in fact, that maybe Bullitt's a little too arrogant, he cuts him loose. With Kennedy, Roosevelt has a relationship that it's really based on politics. And we can talk about that a little bit more down the road of this interview. But they are political rivals, and so there's a real sort of chess game going on all the time between Ambassador Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt. That's just a fascinating thing to read about, and must have been fascinating to watch at the time.
I have to ask, just real quick, in the vein of it takes one to know one, I've got to imagine that FDR saw through William Bullitt's vivaciousness, whatever the proper term is, but at the same time, if you're a great conversationalist, you've got to think that FDR would enjoy that, even if it was in the afternoons over drinks, just kind of getting over the day. But I'm imagining he'd spotted this guy early on.
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell how early he spotted him. Again, I think he felt that Bullitt was just an enormously capable individual, and Bullitt was. He was a very, very bright guy, and was an excellent diplomat. I think his counterparts always respected him, whether he was in Moscow or in Washington or in Paris. But it's when you go and it's a little bit tricky because you go back and it's hard to sort of understand exactly the times. But some of the letters that Bullitt wrote to Roosevelt, how much he missed spending the afternoons with the Roosevelt family, and they always made him feel as though he were part of the family, and he'd write almost these romantic missives to the president, saying, I wish you could be here and at my country retreat in Paris, gazing out over the river. It's just so beautiful.
I'm sure it was.
And I think that kind of thing probably Roosevelt did see through, right, to be honest. And at a certain point, as I say, he grew somewhat tired of both of Bullitt's flattery and of his arrogance as well.
Right. And you just said a couple of seconds ago, and I didn't think about this, FDR is fine with kind of the more superficial stuff that comes through in the information, but as soon as the information is not the quality that he expects, he cuts the guy loose. So I don't think FDR ever forgot what Bullitt was supposed to be doing in the two posts that he was in. So it's the end of 1933. FDR certainly has been busy on the domestic front, but he is keeping up with events in Europe and Asia. And again, this is foreign policy. It's not like FDR has control of everything that goes on in the world. But I guess at this point, even he and his ambassadors, and through his ambassadors, are certainly seeing troubling trends as the year of 1933 goes on.
Well, absolutely. And by 1934, Hitler is firmly in power. There's been a purge within the Nazi Party, and he's Hitler and his cronies have literally murdered their rivals.
Right.
The Austrian prime minister has been killed, Austrian Dollfuss, by the Nazis, and Hitler is well on the way to the Anschluss, which is the annexation of Austria. There have been laws passed in Germany that are very, very harsh on German Jews. There is evidence that the concentration camps have been started. There's also evidence that Germany is beginning to almost immediately to remilitarize. It's because after World War I, they were supposed to not have an army, and as soon as Hitler's in power, he begins to create his military and to make his presence felt around Europe.
Right. He's starting to shake his saber, I think is one expression. Now, there's one point in your book that I enjoyed very much. It's March of 1934, and this is actually around the time, and I wasn't really aware of this, and so I enjoyed learning this from your book. In New York, there's this, I don't know if you want to call it a public demonstration or whatever, it's called The Case of Civilization Against Hitler. And they started this in New York, and they do it in other cities as well. So again, there are some elements in America who are looking at Nazi Germany and go, okay, this is beyond the pale. This is not what's needed at this time. But it was around this time that Ambassador Dodd has his second meeting with Hitler. And as you can imagine, during the first meeting, Hitler probably did 99% of the talking because that's what Hitler does. But this is a moment where Dodd, maybe he's not as like a deer in the headlights as so much, but he's able to talk back, engage with Hitler more, and actually see kind of maybe the truer side of Hitler, if only a little bit, during this second meeting.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Dodd has been there now for nearly a year. He's seen a lot of things that he doesn't like. He's referring in his diary. He kept a private diary, which I used extensively in the book. And he talks about the Nazi leadership. He thinks he frankly thinks they're a bunch of clowns, but he thinks they're very dangerous.
Right.
And he goes to, he in his second meeting with Hitler, he raises a number of issues that he had not raised in the first issue. He talks about the Nazi treatment of Jews, and he also talks about the militarization of the nation. Right. And Hitler goes, semi berserk during this meeting. Right. I mean, he raises his voice. He's yelling at Dodd. He's furious with him. And, I think Dodd is shocked by this, but again, he understands at this time that if Hitler is allowed to continue down this path, that it's going to be very dangerous, not only for Germany, but potentially for all of Europe.
Right. Let me ride on that for a second with two ideas. You speak in your book, and I think this gets lost by people in American society today, but FDR and Hull had an attitude, and I think it was a very established, well-accepted attitude about not interfering in European politics. One, you don't want to get bogged down. You certainly don't want to get bogged down if there's another war, that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that the average American on the street is isolationist. But everything you just said just now is getting back to FDR. He's getting worried, and there's a phrase that FDR has in his book, and I'm paraphrasing, so bear with me. And it's something like, "What do you call a leader with no followers?" It's just a guy taking a walk. And that's what FDR is afraid of. It's like there's this trouble coming, but I can't get the Americans to think about anything other, and I'm not judging them, than their pocketbooks.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, again, you have to remember that while this is all happening in Europe, and we're reading about it, 70 years later, mm-hmm. The United States is in the middle of the Great Depression. And again, people are going hungry. It's a desperate time in our country. Right. And people do remember the First World War, and they wonder, what was it about? Why did we fight it? And, look at the state that we're in now. Mm-hmm. And so, as you suggest, the American public was overwhelmingly isolationist, and that meant that the United States Congress was overwhelmingly isolationist. Right. They did not want to get involved in a far-off country, and in those days, Europe, any of the nations in Europe were far, far away. Again, it's well before the internet. It's well before we were able to turn on a television and see what's happening in Glasgow. Mm-hmm. This is a very, very different time. And Roosevelt was a master politician. He understood the temperature of what was happening, of the people in the United States. And I think the quote you're referring to, it has to do with I think with the World Court and joining the World Court after the United States Congress votes against it, and he says, it's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder as a leader and see that nobody's following you. Right. And so he's very sensitive to that. He knows also, by the way, he's going to have to run for re-election in a little over a year and a half, and so he's very, very aware of that as well. And again, Roosevelt always has his political antenna. Which are very, very finely tuned, mm-hmm. and he's a leader. He's also a politician.
Right. We have to stress to people, never forget that, because he's making decisions what's good for the country and it's good for the international scene. But at the same time, he knows he's going to run for re-election, and that's. I think you were saying earlier, people like Kennedy can really help him. He's very influential. He's got a lot of money. So that's the other side of FDR that should not be forgotten. And you've touched on this just a second ago, but 1935 turns out to be a watershed year for the world. Italy invades Ethiopia, and France doesn't really do anything about it because they don't want to push Mussolini into Hitler's arms. And like you said a couple of minutes ago, Hitler said that Germany is reestablishing its air force. It's going to have universal military service, about 1 million men. So you can, and I'm not trying to make light of this, but you can burn books and you can have parades in the street with your torches. But when Germany does something like this is obviously on a whole different level. And America and FDR have got to respond in some way. And even the American public, I think FDR is hoping, will take notice of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, it's interesting. You talked about Italy invading Ethiopia. That's actually sort of an interesting sidebar about Breckinridge Long, who's the ambassador at the time.
Right.
Long is actually sending these very trenchant, perceptive memos to Roosevelt about Italy and about Italy's goals and objectives. Mm-hmm. And his analysis is spot on. I mean, he is absolutely right about what's happening. He understands that they're doing this with sort of a wink and a nod from the French. But what's interesting about Long is he doesn't think it's that bad. He actually thinks Mussolini's a pretty capable guy here, and that infuriates some of the Roosevelt's advisors. Again, Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as at the time his sort of top advisor, who is Lewis Howe. Mm-hmm. And they say we got to get Breckinridge Long out of there because he's too much of a fan of Mussolini. But the other thing in 1935, Roosevelt, again, to get back to this issue of being both a leader and politically astute, mm-hmm. Congress passes a Neutrality Act, and Roosevelt, which essentially says the United States has to remain neutral in the face of any European conflict and European actions. Mm-hmm. And FDR signs the bill, and he does so somewhat reluctantly, but he understands that that's where the American people are at the time. So he's watching this, and he's getting more and more concerned. He, at a certain point, talks about that the European problems are sort of more worrying than the domestic situation, which is an extraordinary statement. Yes. In 1935. But again, Roosevelt sees what's on the horizon here, and not only again, Long's writing these memos about Mussolini. He's also saying that it looks as though there may be a broader European war. This is also, again, coming from Dodd, who understands what's going on in Germany. And it's coming somewhat from Bullitt, who's still in the Soviet Union, but understands that there's trouble brewing elsewhere in Europe.
Right. That has to be so... I don't know. I'm just trying to picture myself for a second as FDR sitting behind the desk. You've got all this bad news coming in. There's not really much you can do about it. You're still trying to create jobs and make the people feel better about the economy. And you know that you can't really talk to them about international politics because that's not what they're interested in. That doesn't, to them, put food on the table. But it's got to be a very, I don't know if it's frustrating for him or something, or he's just bemoaning the fact that another war is probably coming and his country isn't anywhere near or even desirous of trying to deal with that.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think he is, and I think he's torn at the time, to be honest. Roosevelt is not anxious to get into a war either.
Right.
But he's somebody who, whether it's with the people who work for him or with, the larger issues of the day. Right. Roosevelt's somebody who always wanted to keep his options open, and so he never wanted to have his hands tied. So he signed the Neutrality Act 3 times, always reluctly. Right. But because he never wanted to have his hands tied. He always wanted to have the option to as a president to make a decision. Right. And so I think he's deeply frustrated and doesn't exactly know where the United States is headed in this sort of murky European impending conflict.
Right. Well, every good story needs a point where the absolute bottom falls out for the protagonist, and history obliges us here. So the year of 1936. This is the year that FDR has to run for re-election, but it's to the point where many of his ambassadors in Europe, for various reasons, want to get out when FDR needs this information more than ever, and he certainly needs these experienced hands who've been in these various countries for a while, but for whatever reason, for different reasons, they want to get out when he needs them most.
Yeah, they want to get out, and he also wants some of them back for frankly, for the re-election campaign. So he wants Breckinridge Long back from Italy to help with he thinks he's a very skilled political operator. He wants him working on the campaign. Mm-hmm. William Bullitt is in the Soviet Union. He arrived in the Soviet Union in 1933 with great expectations. By 1936, he hates the job. He's being spied on. Right. He doesn't have access to the top Soviet officials. They're doing nothing about reparations. He's not a happy guy. Right. And he is also a very political, and as we've talked about, a very ambitious person. So he wants to come back and work in the campaign. He even thinks he might be the campaign manager, as does, by the way, Breckinridge Long, and neither one in the end are. Jesse, there's the ambassador to France at the time is a fellow named Jesse Strauss. He's actually ill, and so he comes back. William Dodd is, he's at a loss in Germany now. He's very unhappy. He has made a sort of a pact with himself that he will not entertain any of the top Nazi leadership and won't attend any of their events. So that he really he's to some extent of his own doing, but he's been totally alienated from the Nazi leadership and the Nazi regime. So he has no access, and he's watching this sort of horror movie unfold before his eyes, and he wants to come home. And even Secretary of State Cordell Hull, he's 65 years old. His wife is worried that he's traveling too much. And that he's getting tired, and they don't have a lot of money. This is a chance for him to actually get out and perhaps make some money. He's a fairly accomplished lawyer, so he's thinking about retiring. So yes, there's a wholesale change that Roosevelt is faced with in the State Department. I don't think he necessarily views it as a negative, right. But he's faced with a complete changing of the guard.
Yeah. You were saying earlier that you were a fan of FDR, and so am I. And one of the things I like about him, and this comes across in your book, is that FDR learned a long time ago, don't make a decision if you don't have to. Always keep your options open. So you're right. So even though 1936 sounds like a crazy year to me from what you just said, I think for FDR, he's probably looking at possibilities or opportunities or whatever word you would use, you would like to use. But 1936 certainly is a momentous year for everything that's going on. You've got the Germans marching into the Rhineland. You've got the Olympics being held in Berlin, which makes Hitler, gives him a chance to look like a stable leader, things like that. You've got the Spanish Civil War that starts up. So it is getting tense for different reasons. I'm going to skip a little bit, but the second half of 1937, like you were saying earlier, the predictions of Bullitt and Dodd start coming true. Italy and Germany are coming closer together. Again, FDR can only do so much about that. And now it's where Joseph Kennedy is causing a little bit of friction or problems between the London government, himself, and FDR's White House, because I guess it would be fair to say that Kennedy is an independent thinker and actor.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, just quickly, so this changing of the guard. So now Dodd has left Germany. He appoints, Roosevelt appoints the former ambassador to Switzerland, Hugh Wilson, to be the ambassador to Germany. Bullitt has come home from Soviet Union, and in March and in October, he's made the ambassador to France. And Ambassador Bingham has left, is not a well man. He's left the United Kingdom. And so Roosevelt needs a new ambassador to Britain. And Kennedy really wants this job. He has served loyally served Roosevelt very, very loyally as the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He then takes a lesser job as the head of the Maritime Commission, which is an important position, but it's not a cabinet position. And he's friends with Roosevelt's son, and he says, the job I really, really want is to be the ambassador to the Court of St. James. And so James Roosevelt goes back to his dad and tells him that. And what young Roosevelt writes later in his memoirs is that he and his father had a big laugh about it. They thought it was an absolutely ridiculous idea. But as the weeks go on, Roosevelt reconsiders. And again, he thinks maybe it's not a bad idea to have Joe Kennedy over in England because here's somebody who will shake things. President Roosevelt's not a big fan of the Brits and not a big fan of Neville Chamberlain. And he thinks maybe Kennedy can shake things up a little bit. So there's a sort of interesting dance going on between the two men, but eventually Roosevelt decides to appoint him.
Right. I love that in your book, how that decision kind of evolves, because there's a lot to recommend Kennedy, and there's a lot that's not, as in, one, he likes to be his own person. Two, FDR, if I remember from your book, really didn't give him clear-cut assignments, and so Kennedy was kind of able to do his own thing, and he starts to think that maybe Britain can't stand up to Hitler, and that's maybe not what FDR wants to hear. If I could be juvenile for a second, could you please tell us the story, because I laughed out loud, my wife thought I was crazy, about when FDR brings Kennedy to the White House. It's like, I want to make you ambassador, but there's something I need to see first.
Yeah. Well, so again, there's been this dance between Kennedy and Roosevelt, and first Roosevelt says he's going to appoint Kennedy to be the court of St. James, and then he says, no, I'm not going to, and he tells his son, go back and tell him I'll make him Secretary of Commerce. Right. And so Kennedy says, no, I don't want to be Secretary of Commerce. I want the court of St. James. And then he actually leaks it to the paper that, Roosevelt's going to appoint him to the court of St. James. So Roosevelt is actually a little bit annoyed with Kennedy even before he's in the job.
Gotcha.
So he has him come to the White House, again with his son. And this is, I think I say that it's perhaps the most bizarre job interview in history. Joe Kennedy standing in front of him, and he says, Joe, could you please drop your pants? And Kennedy looks at him, as not surprisingly, as though Roosevelt has, gone out of his mind. And he says, excuse me, Mr. President? And Roosevelt says, drop your pants. And so Kennedy obliges. And so he loosens his suspenders and he lets his pants down. He's standing there in his boxer shorts. And, Roosevelt starts laughing. He says, Joe, he says, everything they said about you is true. You are the most bow-legged man I've ever seen in my life. And you can't possibly, you have to wear knee breeches at your induction ceremony, striped knee breeches and there's no way that you can do that. Everybody will laugh out loud and you'll have no credibility. And, Kennedy is just dumbfounded. So he pulls his pants back up and he says, well, Mr. President, is there anything can we work this out? And, finally Roosevelt says, well, I'll give you a couple of weeks, try to figure it out, if you can find another way to do this. But, they won't let you wear, this is tradition. So you can't go against British tradition. Right. Well, obviously Kennedy is able to work it out and he's able to wear long pants, but, and it's just a humiliating experience for Joe Kennedy. Right. And it's actually sort of a typical, although bizarre, tactic by the president, who wanted to show Kennedy, look, okay, you're gonna get your ambassadorship. You've caused me some trouble here, but you're gonna get it. But just remember who the boss is.
Presidents need a laugh too, and don't mess with FDR because he's thinking like 4 steps ahead. Just not a good. Yeah. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. I did not know that. So again, I was just rolling. My wife thought I'd lost all sense. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because there's some I certainly want to leave for the readers. But so September 30th, 1938 comes. The Munich Agreement is signed. Western Czechoslovakia is handed over to Hitler. And you were kind of touching on this earlier, but clearly Hitler is not appeased. He's going to keep grabbing land. FDR, Kennedy, Bullitt, everybody has their own reactions to this.
Yeah. So, Bullitt thinks that this is dangerous, and he advises again. This is the time when at the point where he advises Roosevelt to rearm the United States. The United States is producing something like 100 planes a month at that point, and Bullitt says you've got to, as president, order that we produce thousands of planes every month. We're going to need an Air Force that is competitive with the Germans, because they are building their own extraordinary Air Force. And he said, you're going to need a 1,000,000-man army. And at the time, we really didn't have any standing army to speak of. I mean, soldiers were training with broomsticks, and so this is a critical time for the United States. Kennedy, on the other hand, thinks that, look, this is happening in Europe. It's far away from the United States. Hitler's going to have his way. We need to find a way to work with him. They're going to be an economic power. He sees everything through an economic lens, and he says we can figure out a way to perhaps to temper Hitler's worst instincts if we have an economic relationship with him. And William Dodd at the time, he's not in office anymore, but he is going around the country giving speeches and saying Hitler is a madman, and he wants nothing short of world domination. So there are a lot of different strains out there. I think Roosevelt understands. He's much more in line with Bullitt's thinking and with Dodd's thinking. He understands how serious this is.
Yeah, absolutely. And to highlight that, and again, I'm going to skip a little bit more, but September 1st, 1939, just after Bullitt tells Kennedy that Hitler does not have the guts to fight, news comes in, obviously it goes all over the world, that Germany has invaded Poland. I think it would be going too far to say that FDR failed. Again, he does not control Europe. But even at this point, he sees, all those years of warnings that he got from his ambassadors. This event finally happens. But even at this point, many in America are like, don't get involved. We have our own problems to fix.
Again, he feels very much as though his hands are tied here. And he is going to move ahead with rearming the United States and with creating a much greater Air Force. But he also wants to help, Britain, which at the time, again, was militarily a very weak country. And, the idea of Lend-Lease is something that, which is essentially loaning or giving surplus American military equipment to Britain and giving them financial aid. It's something he thinks is very, very important.
I could talk for a couple more hours, but I won't do that to you. No one should spend that much time in my company. Ambassador McKean, I'm going to let you end this any way you want, but I do want everybody to know that we have left a lot out. And I think for me, the access that you had to personal stories, diary entries, and the insights that they gave you really fleshed this out for me. And I learned a lot from this book. It comes out on November 9th. On Audible as well. I'm a big fan of Audible and audiobooks and while I'm walking the dog for miles. But Ambassador McKean, if there's any way that you would like to end the story, please feel free. But I, again, just want to thank you for coming on the show and for this book. Whenever I can learn something new or get different perspectives on something that I've been reading since I was 12 years old, it is always appreciated.
Well, Ray, thank you so much for having me. Honestly, it's been a great pleasure to talk with you today. I mean, I think the one thing I will end on a note, sort of, I think, discussing a little bit about Roosevelt, because I think the ambassadors I describe in the book, they are in their own right all interesting people. They really are. They're fascinating individuals, and their interaction with one another is really interesting as well. We didn't really talk about that, but it's a very, very interesting facet of this. But I think the one thing that I sort of enjoyed most about writing it, and I knew, I feel as though I knew a fair amount about Roosevelt, but this really helped to illuminate Roosevelt for me in ways that I hadn't really understood before. Roosevelt is an extraordinary man because he is a very unsentimental individual, and yet he's extraordinarily empathetic as well. He's a very idealistic man. He's somebody who does believe in the global vision in many ways that President Woodrow Wilson set forth. But Roosevelt's a far more pragmatic individual. He's an enormously pragmatic individual. And as we talked about, he's also a very political animal. But he's courageous. He's courageous as hell.
Yes.
And he I think was the right man at the time. So the thing that I think I most enjoyed about this was not only learning about these underappreciated ambassadors, but again, learning a little bit more about Franklin Roosevelt.
Absolutely. And again, for all those listeners, we left a lot out. And this is basically a book about almost the ground game of the 1930s as far as what FDR can do and what he can't do in dealing with all the problems. So again, Ambassador McKean, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thanks so much, Ray. I really enjoyed it.
What's the best part of a Dunkin' run? The coffee or the $1 donut? $2 stuffed bagel minis? Or $3 sausage, egg, and cheese you can add to that coffee? Or the fact that you get to leave the office? The answer, of course, is yes. Time for a Dunkin' run. Great deals on food for $1, $2, or $3 with a medium or larger coffee. America runs on Dunkin'. Excludes specialty donuts and fancies. Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer. Terms apply.